to the Frustrated CEO podcast. My name is Patrick Lyons. I am one of your co-hosts of this show, and I'm here with my two friends and colleagues and co-hosts, Leb Tannenbaum and Patsy Feeman. How are you both?
I'm well.
Excited.
Why would that be?
We have two great guests.
Yes, we do. It is unusual that we have more than one guest. We've done it a couple of times, but it's been a while. But as I was thinking about this and how to tee up our awesome guests for today, if you've listened to our podcast, and you have before, you're hopefully not listening to us for the first time today, but if you've joined us before, we've often said that the two loneliest jobs in the universe are pastor and CEO. And we've had many CEOs on who have affirmed that, but we've yet to actually have pastors. And so we thought one of the things we really like to do on the show is look at old issues through new lenses. And to do that today, we have brought on two great pastors, two good men. The first is Pastor John Fehlen, and the second is Pastor Ryan Holloway. And they're going to help us unpack all the same issues. I think, listener, as you follow along, you're going to hear all the same issues that they are challenged by, you also are challenged by. So let's get to introductions, and then we can get into the heart of the episode. Pastor John Fehlen is originally from Wisconsin and has been a pastor for the better part of 3 decades as a youth pastor, a regular pastor, and then a senior pastor. He's got an undergrad degree in pastoral ministry, a master's in leadership and spirituality, and is currently working on his doctorate in leadership with a global perspective. Today, John and his wife serve as the lead pastors of West Salem Foursquare Church in Salem, Oregon, where they've been for over 15 years. And they've got 4 grown children, their respective spouses, and 4 grandchildren who keep them busy when they are not pastoring at church. Now, Pastor Ryan Holloway is the senior pastor at Calvary Bible Church in Manzanita, Oregon. Pastor Holloway has served in various ministry roles since 2005, serving first in academic development with an INGO in China, Cambodia, and Vietnam, where he taught college and graduate level English as a foreign language class and worked in curriculum design and staff training. After that, he attended Denver Seminary. He completed a healthcare chaplaincy residency before returning overseas to support cross-cultural adaptation and member care, and then moved to Oregon, where he currently serves as senior pastor. When he's not pastoring, Pastor Holloway tries to spend all of his free time with his wife and 3 kids romping through the Pacific Northwest forests with their 2 Rhodesian Ridgeback dogs. Each of you, Pastor John, Pastor Ryan, welcome to the Frustrated CEO podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Set the context for us. Was each of you as senior pastor, was this a career path destination for you? Or did it just kind of happen by accident?
More on the happened by accident. It was one of the rough parts of working internationally is that sometimes the funding just drops out, and then you're kind of left trying to figure out what to do. And so that was part of our story. We came home to transition to a different part of the world, and the funding dropped out, and we were trying to figure out what that means. So sort of fell into church work, I guess you could say, and have been doing it for the last 6 years. So,
John?
Yeah, I would say I was more by design. I think since a young child, I had a desire to be in ministry in some form or fashion. I grew up in Catholicism, and I had the great desire to want to be a priest. And then someone told me that would involve celibacy. And so I just said, well, that ain't going to happen. So I shifted my perspective after coming out of Catholicism into more of a Protestant environment to becoming a pastor. And I've always wanted to be since I was about 14, 15 years old. Began in youth ministry and did that for a number of years, and then senior pastoring. I actually tell people that I got demoted from the youth pastorate to the senior pastorate. Honestly, I would give anything to go back to youth ministry today and have less of the weight and the burden there. But I love just people in general. I love serving the church.
Now, thank you both. I mentioned for our listener, the reason we've invited you on today. First of all, you're both very interesting, and a lot of what you're challenged by challenges our CEO listener. So to set the context for our listener, what we want to cover today in this episode is how do you show up well, right? And we talked about the two loneliest jobs in the universe, CEO and pastor. And the reason for that, as they say, is you always have to have it all together. You always have to look like you're like you've like you know no issues, no challenges. You're always available for everybody. Um, so the primary focus for this episode is how do you navigate through that? What's the self care? What are the boundaries? How do you manage burnout? Those kinds of things, all very relevant issues to our CEOs. So maybe that's just a good place to start. John, I know you've done a lot of work on preventing burnout, and Ryan, I'm sure same thing. You've got practices and thoughts, but maybe a first question right out of the gate is talk about boundaries. Right, you're both always on call. I think, much like CEOs, you're always on call. How do you maintain good boundaries to be able to fulfill the duties of the job and be available to people, but also be able to fulfill the duties as husbands and fathers and that self-care piece?
Yeah, I'll approach that first. I think seasonally, there's always going to be different focuses because in different seasons, while your children are younger, perhaps as they move into elementary or middle or then high school, adult children gives you a whole nother realm of time and availability, and you can approach things differently in different seasons. And so I've looked at that as my now in my 50s, I approach things differently than I did in my 20s and 30s. I am not fond of saying this, but it's part of my story that around 30, I had a pretty significant meltdown, just professionally and emotionally, and found myself pretty much ready to cash it in. And not in a death sense, but just in a sense of just absolute desperate walk away from it. I don't want to do this anymore. I'd rather sell coffee or just panhandle on the streets. Honestly, is what I was thinking. But there is something that I learned through that process that now carried into my 40s and 50s that I didn't know then. I was driven by performance, driven by people's expectations of me. And you start to shed that just through maturity as you get older, but also you don't naturally just shed it. You have to make some conscious decisions as to how you're going to live differently in light of what you've experienced. And so I had some rough experiences that then informed my next season. And we can get a little deeper into that. But it really took an emotional shaking to get me to that. Otherwise, I would have carried some of those same behaviors. And I say, if I hadn't experienced what I experienced at 30, I don't think I'd be still doing what I'm doing at 50.
And what kind of support in that rough time what kind of support did you get?
Well, for me personally, the greatest form of support would come through my wife. Secondly, through a very dear, close friend that has been my friend since college and until today. So that's the support structures that were the most intact. Now, there's obviously organizational systems that come into play, but a lot of times if you lean on those too heavily, you find out just how frail they really are, that they aren't able to necessarily support you. You've got to find other avenues of encouragement and find your well-being in other places. And I was able to do that through my spouse, through my friendships, and that was really sustaining for me.
Ryan, how about you talk about boundaries? How do you maintain good boundaries?
Yeah, it's a struggle, like John was sharing. One of the struggles with probably a lot of people who go into a pastoral type role is one of the defaults is sort of having that desire to fulfill the expectations of the people you're serving. And so that creates a whole lot of boundary struggles. And so part of it is learning the hard way. Unfortunately, very few of us probably enter a situation with our boundaries laid out and able to really manage them well. So for me, a lot of it was the hard work of not having them and then trying to deal with the frustration and anger and tiredness and everything else, and then trying to reflect on that and say, well, why do I feel this way
Mhm.
about this aspect of my work? And it's because there's a boundary that I would like to have, but it wasn't there. So then you have to try to determine what that is, set the boundary, and work on enforcing it, which
Hmm.
is always a struggle. But yeah, so that's been part of my own process, is looking at where are my frustrations and sort of pain points in things that I really enjoy doing,
Right.
and then figure out if that's a boundary issue or something else.
So if you both, this questions, obviously for both of you, if you do the hard work and you identify certain boundaries that you want to set, right? And maybe it hasn't been that way because you've been in this discovery process. What do you do to actually set a boundary that maybe wasn't set before, or creates an impact on other people, and whatever their response to that is?
I think Ryan really touched on an issue that's a pain point. You mentioned that phrase, pain point.
Mhm.
I think that's so important. Until we reach a place of frustration, anger, meltdown, boundaries being crossed repeatedly to our detriment, we don't tend to make change. So change happens when we're uncomfortable, and so when we get uncomfortable, like, we hear stories. Oftentimes they're sad stories, but we hear stories of individuals who will have a heart attack, and then their health is of great priority to them at that moment, and now they're moving forward with a diet and they're taking care of their body. Or those that would have a marriage dissolve, and all of a sudden now I need to get my life in order. So I think finding that little pain point of what is the challenge and how do we move forward to see that grow. It's a ever evolving journey of dealing with one thing. It's what we say. We say it's 5 steps forward, 10 steps back. You can move forward in some regards, and then you end up moving back in others. So it's just taking incremental steps of growth personally and making boundaries and holding to them.
Yeah.
I have a mentor of mine that would always say, sorry, Ryan, I didn't mean to
No,
cut you
you're
off,
good.
but I would always say, start small, but start right away. The idea of meaning, if you want to set some boundaries, set them small,
Mhm.
but start now. Do it right now. Don't wait. Don't try to think about the grand boundary that you may not ever be able to achieve, but just start small, but start right away.
And for me, the second piece would be to communicate that to those around you. So if nobody knows the boundary is there, then they're going to constantly cross it. And then if you get upset at them or frustrated by it, it's kind of on you. So the next piece would be, once you establish that boundary, you have to make it known. And that's the struggle when you're implementing new boundaries, especially in a congregation setting like John and I work in, because not everybody's going to know what that boundary is, and they're going to be working off of past assumptions. So there's a lot of education and just communication that you have to do in order for a boundary to be there, so that people know. And then once they know, usually the relationship will help keep that boundary, or massage the boundary, or whatever needs to happen there.
That's great. I know every time the boundary conversation comes up, people, like, we know what boundaries are, and yet sometimes we struggle with knowing, well, what does it mean to set a boundary? Like, what are my boundaries even? And so a lot of times I like to think of boundaries as my rules for engagement. Like, if in order for us, I want to know your rules for engagement as well. Like, how do we need to communicate with each other? Boundaries in your role, I would imagine, have to include how often you're available, how quickly you can respond, things like that. But that's always been helpful for me to think about boundaries as my rules for engagement. And you can have those rules of engagement between people, like a spouse or at work, and you can have those rules of engagement between you and the entity that you work for as well. Like in order for me to feel valuable here, in order for this to be healthy for me, these are the parameters. These are my rules of engagement. Your work also gets to set those, and hopefully, or they mesh. It's a good relationship for you both. But where it's not, then that's a conversation. that's the communication piece, Ryan, that you're talking about.
Mhm.
If you don't communicate it, people will inadvertently cross them.
Patrick, I'll give you, I think, a humorous yet appropriate example of that.
Great.
15, 16 years ago, working in a former church than where I am now, I can recall pulling the staff together for a staff meeting, and I declared this with great passion that I was going to stop working at the church. And I let that just hang out there for a bit, and I didn't complete my sentence, whatever, but I just said, I'm going to stop working at the church. And there was a silence, there was a hush, there was concern in eyes. But then I followed it up with saying, I'm going to start working on the church, not at the church. And the idea, and I know it's semantics, but the call to the team and to my own heart was, I have got to get out of the weeds and get what I think Patrick Lencioni will say, to the balcony, and get up 30,000 feet and work from that perspective rather than in so deep. So it was a boundary setting moment to say,
Yep.
I've hired a team, that's you, and I need you to do what you're doing, and I need to be free to do the things that I'm best to do. And so I'm going to stop working at the church. I'm going to start working on the church and organizationally giving some care and some direction that I couldn't do when I was so deep in the weeds.
This isn't necessarily a business, but we're working in businesses pretty frequently who we're discovering have a problem with clear roles and responsibilities. So I'm wondering, since one of you, this was by design and the other was not exactly by design, and you're both pastors, two things. One, do you feel that there is a clear role and responsibilities piece in your, for you in your position? And maybe it goes beyond that to, those who are running other parts of the business, or in this case, the ministry. And if we really get out there, if you really knew what it took, would you have changed your mind? Or decided, I got to go back, Ryan, I got to go back to Cambodia.
Well, just to jump in real fast, I would say that I agree with John, and I would have stayed in youth ministry.
Yeah. Oh boy. 100 times over. Absolutely.
Now tell us more about what that
Yeah.
actually means to you. And also, is there, a good, clear job description? Is there a need for roles and responsibilities, clarity? And again, knowing that we're running into less and less of clarity than I think maybe it's post-COVID, but it's there.
Yeah. So if you ask probably the average person what a pastor does, most people probably would say something like they talk on Sundays.
Yeah.
If you ask the average congregation member what a pastor does, they would probably say, well, they talk on Sundays. So largely there's an unknown aspect to what pastors do, to what the role is, to how we serve a congregation, but also a congregation within a community.
Right.
So there's sort of constant, again, education on what goes on as far as what I do. So my work schedule is Sunday to Thursday is my official work week. So what happens on Monday through Thursday is sort of a mystery to a lot of folks. So there's always kind of communication and that on what we do. And so largely those outside of the church and even those who aren't real deep in the church structure, they don't really know what the role is until they need it. From the church leadership side, there's the group of what we call elders, who sort of work as like the leadership, the trustees sort of thing. They know the ins and outs. They know me. They know what I do. They know my schedule, and they know the congregation oftentimes differently than I know the congregation, and so we all work together on this whole job thing that we do in a church. So there's that question has multiple levels to it.
Yeah.
There's sort of the person outside the church, the average regular attender, and then there's those in sort of the leadership levels of the church, and each of those have different answers to how the role is understood, and how you communicate it, and what that means for the church, the corporation, boundaries, all of that.
Mm.
That's well put, Ryan. I would add maybe just a couple more things, and that would be that it is very nebulous. Most people do perceive that you just work on Sundays. That's actually the golden joke that people have is, oh, you work one day a week. And we know that's not true. I think instinctively most people know that's not true, but it is kind of a joke because they don't see what you do the rest of the week. I can tell you there's always anomalies, but if we're still on kind of the idea of boundaries, if we can set some boundaries to what the frame of our day and our week looks like, it really does help. So then when the anomalies come, like for example, after 35 some years of ministry, last night in a counseling session with my wife and another individual in our congregation, I heard something I have never heard in 35 years. And in terms of just the devastation of humanity, just the way humanity has been so brutalized. And that it was not shocking to me, but it came out of a space where I thought, I've never heard that. So there was something new after 35 years of ministry. But for the most part, there are some systems and there's some flows. Like, okay, I'll get real practical on this one. I work also from Sunday to Thursday and take Fridays and Saturdays off. And I have found that I can categorize my days into 3 categories. So I've realized, no one's told me this, but I just know instinctively, I've done the work, that I personally, John Fehlen, as a pastor, exists to, number 1, train leaders, number 2, inspire followers, and number 3, to pastor a community. And that's very different than a church. And I'm able to go through each day and go, today, like Sundays, I know I inspire followers. I exist to inspire people. On Mondays, mostly it's my staff day, and I exist to train leaders. On Tuesdays, I will be preparing a message from the start of the day till the end of the day, and it never bleeds over to another day for me. That's how I've set kind of a rule for me, is I'll prepare a message only on Tuesdays, and I exist to inspire followers on that day. And then Wednesday and Thursday, for the most part, I've been given great freedom, and it's a blessing in our congregation for me to go pastor a community. And so I spend most of my time in coffee shops or around the city pastoring people outside of our church. So there's some rails to run on, and it helps give clarity. So when people ask, what are you doing today? I can actually answer them so it doesn't feed or reinforce that notion that we only work on Sundays.
And are those three kind of areas, is that what you have developed for yourself?
Yeah.
Based on your own values and based on what, you've been hired to do and based on what you see is needed?
Yes, there's a caveat to what you just said, because hired to do is a very interesting phrase. And it's the reason why, Ryan, if you're listening to audio, you're not seeing him smile, but he's smiling and laughing, because we know we've been hired. Ultimately, if we want to be a little crass about it, we've been hired to grow a church, to to build a bigger church, and to have people feel good about their faith community. And there's a lot of little idiosyncrasies in that, and a lot of little details that can really mess with you in your psyche as to, well, what do I exist for? Is it just to make people happy? Is it to just fill seats? And if you really do the work, the heart work and the hard work of discerning who you really are, that's where I came to those 3 things after many years. That didn't come to me when I was 18. That was fleshed out over 25 years of, no, this is what I exist for. And if I could do that, that's my best investment into this organization and into ultimately something in the faith community we know as the kingdom of God.
So we often ask CEOs and leaders, what's their purpose?
Mhm.
to identify their purpose. I'm actually surprised how many people can answer that question. So it's refreshing to hear your clarity
Hmm.
around that. But would that be kind of synonymous with what you say is your purpose, and you happen to be pastoring in a church or in a community, bring that purpose to life?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Patsy, because I'm just doing that kind of soul work, even in my own mind right now, thinking, I wonder if those 3 issues and 3 points that I've just articulated would actually overlay into any other area of my life. And for example, I've oftentimes mused with my own wife saying, I'm ready to quit. A lot of, by the way, we could get into COVID kind of discussions. And a
Mhm.
lot of ministers, the stats are coming back, and a lot of ministers are quitting. Um,
Yes.
Whenever I bemoan that with my wife and I say, I'm just going to go brew coffee at a local coffee shop, she's like, well, here's the problem is you're going to bring your same drive and
Mhm.
your same psychosis and your same anxiety all into that. And so I've realized I probably would. And even if I were doing that role, I think I would find myself trying to um
Mhm.
to train leaders, inspire followers, and ultimately kind of pastor, which just means care for a community. So that's an interesting little process you went through there with me, Patsy. Thank you for that.
You're
I,
welcome.
I was
And
yeah,
statistically, more CEOs are leaving being CEOs than
Yeah.
ever before, too.
yeah.
So, there's,
I was thinking that same thing as you were saying that, John, that no matter what job you're doing, it sounded as you were speaking it sounded more like those are John Phelan characteristics than requirements of the job. And that wherever you find yourself, that you didn't start doing that when you got into ministry. You were probably doing that long before that, maybe not with that clarity. And knowing that this is where it's all relevant to our CEO listener, to the business listener, is knowing what it is that you need to be doing. Like, what is your core purpose? Understanding that can help you bring order out of chaos, right? Can help you know how to structure your day or where the boundaries need to be reset. It's having that clarity, but that's mirror work, as I like to call it. That's, as you said, you didn't always know that.
Mm-mm.
You put the thoughts into that. Ryan, I see you like, what are the wheels spinning in your head?
No, I really like the John's 3 categories there. They're in many ways they resonate quite strongly.
Hmm.
For me, I'm more of a teacher. And so with all of the COVID statistics, there's been times when it's like, all of the, and even pastors I know this guy who's not in ministry anymore. I know this guy who's not in ministry anymore. I'm like, what would I do if I wasn't doing this? And as I think about other positions, it's like, well, I would still want to teach.
Mm-hmm.
I would still want people to know themselves better. I would still want better communication. I would still want, people to be heard and know that they have worth and dignity and everything they say matters. Just encourage their general, personhood throughout the day. Even I'm like, so wherever I land, those things would still be true.
John, you mentioned the number of ministers who are leaving, and Patsy's already referenced the number of CEOs who are leaving. So I know you're doing work for your doctorate on burnout,
On this, yeah.
on this very thing. And so when we met in advance of today's recording, you've got a lot to share on that topic. I think the 4 things I'll turn it over to you, but talk about burnout. And again,
Yeah.
it's very relevant to our listeners.
Yeah, and Patsy was correct. It's not isolated to just ministers. We're seeing this across the board. The conversations as I pastor in a community are that I'm seeing head chefs, business owners, restaurant owners, baristas. I mean, we're just working our way all the way through every echelon of work. People are overwhelmed. The word that I've been using is beyond tired. You know how you oftentimes say, I'm just tired. And that is not enough. I don't think that really articulates it enough. I'm actually finding most people, including myself, are weary. And that's a deeper sense. It's oh, it's something right to the very bone and the core of who you are. Now, why is that? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and I'd love to unpack this more maybe in a year when I'm done with my doctorate, and I can have you call me doctor. I'm really looking forward to that. But I have been finding in some of the preliminary research through interviews, through interviewing stakeholders and just key individuals, both denominationally and outside of the faith community, is that there's a couple combinations of reasonings. This is what I'm at least reducing it down to. I'm sure others can contribute to this with their voice, but I'm finding that maybe a combination of self-care that is extremely waning. Now, in my circle of influence, we would call it more of a soul care, but interchange it with self-care, soul care, regardless, it's waning. We're just not taking care of ourselves the way we ought. Also, secondly, and this one is in the research is coming out more and more and more, and it has to do with joy, a diminishing joy quotient. And I kind of debunked it, thinking it felt very fluffy and not so academia. But I'm coming back to it again and again and again in my readings, saying this is a real issue: joy and not happiness. It's about something deeper than happiness, joy. Thirdly, and it's been mentioned already, I think earlier on in this particular podcast, it has to do with expectations, undue expectations for what is being placed upon leaders right now, and it's not lining up. And I think because of us in our society, our culture post COVID, that is a rub that we can't reconcile right now. People are wanting to function differently, and the roles that they're in are not matching, and it's causing friction. In a biblical term, it's like we maybe are familiar with King David in the Old Testament. It says one time that he took his predecessor, Saul, who was king at the time, and took his armor and tried to put it on, and it didn't fit. And he realized, I can't wear Saul's armor. And I think there's a generation rising that are finding themselves under undue expectations, saying, I can't function like that. And that's an interesting avenue to go down at maybe at some point. And then fourthly, rather, and this one has a lot of dynamics, again, in a faith realm. But what I'm finding in surveys and in conversations is an underdeveloped understanding. We would call it a theology, which is like the study of God, but an underdeveloped understanding of suffering. And this one has really surprised me as well, that we don't really know what to do with and where to put the idea of suffering and how that fits in how we're feeling. So there's a lot to be said there, but those are the four components that I've been early on in this degree starting to discover is a real issue for people in terms of burnout. And I wonder, maybe I could throw this back to you guys. How does that connect at all to CEOs that you're having conversations with?
I would say it connects in many places. There's kind of several distinctions in there. I think people are voting with their exits as well as where they enter. And a lot of people are saying, I'm not doing a good job of taking care of myself, and I'm not going to be able to do that in this particular organization. So I'm going to go do something else. Right. I think, the tie into, soul care and self-care shows itself maybe in business around issues that are important to people. The purpose of the company, sustainability might be something that would cause someone to say, I think I'd like to go work there. At least it's going to nurture my soul because I care about climate change or whatever the case may be. So that's where they choose to work, or that's where they choose to exit and go find something that's more meaningful, a more meaningful place for them to work. And that would be, I think, true in the church. The distinction, I was going to ask you a question about joy. So the distinction between happiness and joy, and with you leading a community and a congregation. So, I'll just share that for me, Pastor Ryan has got a really good sense of humor. And there are times when that levity is absolutely necessary. Some of it is self-deprecation, but he's got a great sense of humor. Now, that's not necessarily the deeper level of joy that maybe many of us are longing for.
But it's an element of it, though.
But it's an element. And when it comes to burnout, and I've, having worked for a long time with leaders, sometimes leaders want to get out of the position that they're in because of the spotlight, because of they feel that they should be funnier than they are, or they should be more visionary than they are, or more inspirational than they actually feel they are. But so go back to, they only work once a week on Sundays. I mean, spotlight is on you. I'm just wondering if that contributes to you at times where you question, this isn't natural for me. I think Patrick was sharing with us, John, like you think of a strength in the relational realm, and someone else may think of it in the visionary and inspirational realm. Well, how does that play out so that you can settle in and say, this is who I am, and I'm going to give all the gifts I have away, and that's good enough.
I think yes to all of that, Leb. There's often a conversation about leading from your strengths versus leading from your weaknesses. A lot of times, what may be a strength in one aspect of our work is not something that produces joy. It's sometimes, so for me, I can do administrative work, and we're a small church, so there's a lot of administration work to do, and I can build spreadsheets. I can manage the couple staff that we have. I can develop the literature that we need for publicizing, marketing, all of that. Like I can do that. It's great. It works. In our community, the meager skills that I have in that are a strength. But it's, if I had to do that day in and day out, it wouldn't be a work situation that I would wake up for in the morning and really want to go to, get down to work at. That's where the conversation on purpose that Patsy brought up earlier really comes into play. Because if I think of myself more as my purpose in being here is really to do some of the teaching aspect, and to do some of the listening and relational support and counseling and stuff like that. Those are the things that are the parts of my job that do bring the joy and the inspiration and the desire to come back on Monday. But so some of it is also trying to then manage the amount of time that I spend doing what I have to do versus what I want to do. And so that's maybe a piece of it for me in this role. John?
Yeah, you've just sparked a thought in my mind, and that is that there is something to be said about the care that comes from a smaller church, a smaller organization, like you mentioned you're leading, that can get lost sometimes in the process as a church gets larger. An organization grows and loses touch with some of the things that made it very special and very warm and inviting. And so you've got to work differently in different stages of an organizational's growth. Now, it brings to mind something that I just realized, and that is, I've known this, I just realized it again, this fresh moment, that is, I work primarily in a realm where volunteers run so many things. And the old joke is that there's a lot of people that come to our church and and they're volunteering, serving, but they're working full-time jobs, and then they're coming and doing the things that you need them to do because you can't pay everybody to do it. So we've got a staff of 10, and that's really lean for the size of our church, but we've got to rely on a lot of volunteers. So you have to learn how to delegate pretty well. And I don't know if I can even maybe take this and shoot it this direction, but the idea of delegation is so important regardless of what size organization you're in. You've just got to learn how to give that away because you're not good at everything. So there's things I can't do. And I came up with this grid. This was foundational for me about 25 years ago, but I just started working on what I call my musts, my MUSTS musts. And I realized this kind of 5-step process, and that is, it's must discern. So I start with discerning who I am. And that's what came out of that process of, like, I exist to train leaders, inspire followers, and pastor a community. So I have to discern who I am. And then what are the things I must do? Only I can do. And I started with the fact that only I can really love my wife the way I'm supposed to. Only I can parent my children. Only I
Mm.
can, and I took it to even organizational elements of I am the primary teacher at our church. So I'm the primary voice that they're being led by as a shepherd. So must discern, must do, must ditch. What must I get rid of that doesn't fit within that? Okay. And it leads to the next one because we mentioned delegation. So must delegate. Now, the reason I put that fourth is because I've got to get rid of some things that nobody should do. There's barnacles that get attached to the ship of every organization that when you do discerning work, you go, no one should do that. I should not delegate that to some other staff member. No one. That needs to just go away. So ditch is first, then delegate. Then ultimately it gives space and freedom to develop. And what can I now develop? And that's honestly, I've had some of my best ideas come out of that process where I go, wait, if I wasn't doing X, Y, and Z, and if someone else was doing, this 1, 2, 3, that just opens up so much space for me now to create and dream that I couldn't do before. So delegation, ditching, all that, I think is such an important process.
That's very relevant to our
It's very, yes.
our listeners.
Is it?
Very
Yes.
relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just to tag off of that, I have a very similar process, but from a medical background as a chaplain of triaging with levels of acuity. With whenever something comes into the office or comes across my desk or whatever the community excitement is that day, very similar to your
How do you do that? How do you triage it?
So for me, it's the level of acuity. First of all, do I need to do it? Secondly, how quickly does it need to be done? And then thirdly, how far down can I push this?
It's interesting because there's been some late I can't pinpoint the research, but I've been reading and I'd have to think about where it came from. But some research is coming out regarding the power of procrastination. And how far can I push that down? How far can I kind of set that aside and then get to it later? And some of our best work comes out of that when we learn how to positively procrastinate rather than just dealing with what was it Charles Hummel calls the tyranny of the urgent.
Yeah. Well,
Right.
if you find that, I'd like to read that.
Okay, I'm going to look that up.
John, when you find that, if you share that with me, I'll make sure that it gets posted with this podcast.
Good.
So,
Yeah. Thank you.
that'd be awesome.
I have one other question. Let's talk about money for a minute. Everyone has, I guess, a personal relationship to money, just like we talked about finding your purpose. And the businesses and the CEOs that we work with, where the company's doing well, seem to do better or feel more optimistic, maybe more joyful. And there's a lot of organizations under financial pressure right now with maybe diminishing funds, trying to figure out how do I do as much as we did before. And so maybe some of this comes into what you were both talking about. How do I triage on a reduced budget or anything along those lines? And it's kind of like, how do you stay healthy with some things that are, and what I always use is I'm always asking myself what's in my control and what's not in my control. And it's a lot easier for me to accept things that are in my control and make some decisions than the things that feel out of my control. But certainly, father of 7 here, there have been times when it's been very, very lean and I feel the stress. And there have been times when we're kind of cruising and it feels very different.
I'll make a quick comment and then I'll hand it over to Ryan on this one. But churches, like any business, is a fiscal organization as well, and it takes funds to manage and to run and to operate and to flourish. It is donation based, so there's some incentive when it comes to tax breaks and different things of that nature. But people give willingly or not, and we say that people will vote with. You mentioned, Leb, about voting with their feet or voting with their entry and exits. We would say also people vote with their pocketbook or their credit cards or their bank statements. Two things that keep me up more than anything else would be money and staffing. So those are the two big issues that I constantly, and they tend to be tied together.
Yep.
Because staff will either make or break you when it comes to how it contributes to life of the church, which ultimately contributes to what comes in with revenue, or they'll drain it and there'll be a liability. So and finding good people to serve and to be on your team is a very difficult thing. So that keeps you up at night. So does money. But I've learned to over the years to reduce down. Sorry, I was going to make a quick comment here, but I would just to just finish here would be to really surrender that to, without being overly spiritual on this, I would say there's something to be submitted to just the sovereignty of God that says, this is not my task to necessarily be up all night thinking about. I trust that you're going to hold your church in your hands, and you're going to care for it, and I'm going to be the best I can be in terms of stewarding the gifts and resources you've given. So sorry, Ryan, I didn't mean to.
No, it's good. Just in a very real way for an organization our size, I am the greatest financial liability to it. I'm the greatest expense. And so, there's like you were saying, Leb, like John mentioned, there's a few ways that it plays into, organizationally. There's me as my personal financial profile, what I need for my family so that our kids can have shoes to go to school and raincoats so they don't get, drenched every day here. So there's that level that just has to be there. And if it's not there, then something has to happen in my life so that our family can have what they need.
Right.
Now from the faith-based perspective, we're a nonprofit and it works off of that. From the faith-based perspective, years ago, I read this comment by Dawson Trotman, the one of the founders of Navigators, and what he told their early navigators was, because they had no money as the organization was starting and they were going off and ministering and teaching and all of that. He'd say, hey, you know what? It's going to be hard, and you're going to have to go into a situation where you're going to be in front of people and you probably don't have money for food or for your family or whatever the case is. So here's what we're going to do. We're just going to pray before we go. We're going to put a toothpick in our mouth and we're going to go do our jobs. And the image is that, these people who are just starting this early ministry, back in the day when people would use toothpicks, it's not common anymore, but the toothpick was a sign of, I just had my full meal. I am satisfied. I am full. And now I'm doing my work. So part of it was the dependence on, again, from a faith-based perspective, dependence on God, that the work that you're doing, he will somehow provide the things that you need. It may not be all that you want, but it will be what you need. Even if at that moment, it's the energy to do what you have to do. So because, as a church, as a nonprofit, we are bound by what comes in. We can't make more products. We can't find a new market to advertise in.
Right.
And here at Calvary, we made the decision, partly during COVID, when we couldn't pass a plate, so to speak, or pass the bags to collect contributions and all that. So we stopped doing it then, and we haven't restarted.
No, we haven't either.
And it's been a kind of a wonderful thing to just see how it works.
I agree.
So sometimes it's there's the personal, there's the professional, but then sometimes it's just a piece of faith where you just put your toothpick in your mouth and you just issue a little prayer and go do what you got to do.
And Leb, I would add that trust is at an all-time low in the market, in the church world. And so this aspect of money is an important one you're bringing up, and we don't shy away from it. I think we get stereotyped as churches are money grabbing, and I don't know Ryan personally, but I can just in hearing him can trust the heart that he has. That I think the majority of pastors and leaders in a faith circle are not out to make a buck. The majority of them are honest, hardworking individuals that are leading with fiscal sanity and trying to increase trust within the sectors around us. So trust is a big deal right now. I mean, there's a lot of people questioning the what CEOs are making, the severance packages, and documentaries, and a lot of exposés are coming out that are attacking and revealing areas in which the church, that's the capital C church, have failed in this regard and have for many years. And so it really it behooves us to increase levels of trust and transparency, accountability. All that is so important.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's and again, so much of that is relevant to it's relevant to the business. It's relevant to the CEOs. Everything that you were just saying. I feel like we could keep going and going and going, but even some of the things that you've already said, I want to. So for our listener, we are gonna. We're actually there's so much great content. Ryan and John have graciously agreed to come back for a second episode where we'll focus a little bit less on the development of you, the leader, and more about leading the organization because they certainly have that perspective to share as well. All right, listener, thank you for sticking with us to the end of another episode of the Frustrated CEO podcast. You can find this episode's Let's Get Practical on our website at thefrustratedceo.com. Ryan, for those who might want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to contact you or find you or follow you?
Through our church website, calvarymanzanita.com, .org. It's one of those. And
Excellent.
yeah, email and contact and all of that information is there on the website. So
excellent. Good. Thank you. Thank you in absentia to our to Pastor John Fehlen, who also joined us for almost all of the episode. We will certainly, we'll be back with Ryan and John for a second round of content with each of them, again, on their perspectives about running the challenges of building a great organization. So I think that's it. Listener, we'll see you again next time on the Frustrated CEO podcast.